Welcome to the Vintage Downhill Podcast. I'm Chuck Davis, your host. I'm joined here today with Steve Glasson and Jamie from Britain. And our special guest this morning is Brent Foes of Foes Fabrication. Brent, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Hey, Brent, as we were discussing just prior to hitting the record button this morning, we're all big Foes fans. We run probably the biggest vintage downhill group there is, something like 40,000 people or so.
Uh-huh.
And it appears that Foes is the #1 vintage downhill brand when people think of vintage downhill. So we're really glad to have you on here today. And we just wanted to have a conversation a bit about Foes history. And then, we'll probably go chronologically and catch up to what you're doing today, and maybe have a couple questions for you about what's in store for your future. But yeah, thanks once again for joining us. Do you want to do a brief intro of yourself and your company?
Yeah, my name is Brent Foes. We build mountain bikes here at the shop and started business back in 1992.
Yeah, with the LTS, right?
Yeah, we started with the LTS. There were some bikes way before then, not way before, but some of my first bikes had different names for them.
Mm-hmm.
But when I came out with some different names, I was reminded that they were already taken by somebody else, and so you go through all this legal matter. So
yeah,
I ended up our production bike was called the LTS. And everything we started and did all had a sort of a story to it. And the LTS was basically, called long travel system. And we were contacted by GT one time and said that that we couldn't use LTS because they were using that on their bike. And so we did a trademark search and found out that they didn't trademark it. So we went ahead and trademarked LTS and mentioned that to them. And then they came back to me and said, well, can't we just all get along, And I said, I don't care. I'm not trying to create problems. I don't want to get into it and stuff like that. So, eventually we ended up, changing that down the road. But it's a lot of silliness that we have gone through with larger companies and stuff that, I guess they didn't really like what I was doing, or, were concerned about, what we were doing or how we were making stuff and what have you. And, I've gone through stuff with Cannondale and other companies and stuff, but, things change so rapidly that I wasn't going to spend a ton of money to fight people in court and stuff. So we just kept moving along.
That's so common in the bike industry, isn't it? And just completely silly. I mean, Cannondale copywrote the word free ride at one point.
Yeah. The one issue we had with Cannondale was we came out with a weasel, and they had patented it was the top tube, or no, it was what was it? It was the top tube going down to, I know. It was the top tube going from the seat tube to the down tube, but down about, 6 inches. And then they put another tube going from the top tube to the head tube. And we were making our weasel that had the top tube was coming from the head tube to the seat tube, like a normal bike, and the normal down tube. And then we put a tube going from the top tube to the down tube to triangulate that area for our shock mount. And if you looked at it and squinted a little bit, it would look like their shape. And they said we were infringing on their patent because they had patented that. So we ended up changing it and stuff like that because I wasn't going to deal with it. It was sort of silly, but one thing about Cannondale, they wanted to patent everything. And yeah, that's one of many stories we went through the process of trying to build bikes and stay out of trouble.
So
Brent,
The LTS had that kind of flying V shape, right? The front trunk
Yeah.
kind of looks like a flying V guitar. You mentioned that you had some earlier bikes. Were they earlier in design or just in name?
Well, the very first, I mean, the early bikes were actually designed that way. I have one shape, one basically V shape like that that's actually in the Mount Hall of Fame. Um, that that actually never got finished because it just at that time I wasn't really sure what I was doing and it just seemed a little too big. But that was actually our first shape that we made, and that was our introduction to trying to learn how to hydroform stuff. Where we had to that stuff was actually done by an aerospace company that did parts for airplanes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I remember staying around your place, Brent. Must have been probably around 2007 or something. And tucked away at the back of your garage, you had all of the classic bikes, the unique stuff, the leaf spring bike and stuff like that tucked away. And I remember that exact frame. I remember you pulling it out and saying it was one of the first ones you'd ever made.
Yeah. The leaf spring bike, those were sort of experimental bikes that we built after that, during our racing season and stuff. Because I had a lot of different ideas that I wanted to try. And all these ideas sort of came back from my off-road background, building off-road cars, but just everything was scaled down to fit in the bicycle application. But the very first bike I made, I put 6 inches of travel in the rear. And my belief was just like, it's there if you need it. And at the time there weren't any forks to actually match that until it slowly progressed. And then I was actually forced into making all that stuff myself too. So.
Where did you get the idea for monocoque? Did that come from off-road racing trucks? It seems like that's a little bit of Foe's trait.
All the off-road stuff, all of the roll cages are all made out of tubing and stuff. And, I had my fair share of all that. And I didn't want to build a bicycle using tubing because it would have looked like all the others out there. So I just played around with forming aluminum. One of the very first ones I tried to form out of titanium. But that was a whole nother department and stuff like that. So I learned a lot, forming aluminum and stuff like that. And I just wanted something that would look a little different. And, you can actually triangulate things a lot stronger without adding a lot of weight.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that always amazes me, Brent, is as a carpenter myself, is when you actually see one of your early moldings for the frames is actually made up of layered MDF that you've then hand shaped and formed to do some prototype rough shapes before you then machine the the mold or the die that you press it over. But is that something you still do a lot of?
Yeah, we still hydroform our frames in the same way. We do it in house now. I don't go out and have it done anymore because I had to make appointments to go get prototypes done and all that, and it just took up too much time. So I ended up creating my own hydroform machine. But yeah, we'll make some wooden patterns. Some things that I know that are actually going to be the shape that I want, I'll just go ahead and make them out of aluminum to save time and stuff. Because sometimes you can get away with doing certain things out of wood, but if things are a little bit more difficult or a little bit more complex, the wood most likely will probably break. So we just make it out of aluminum, and they're all still done all by hand and everything. So I'll cut them out in the bandsaw and grind them and shape them and everything and by hand. We could do that. We have a 5-axis machine that we could do that on, but by the time we program it and do all of that, I could have them done in a couple days.
Brent, what is your relationship with the Japanese market? From a collector's perspective, it seems like there's a very heavy following from the Japanese, and I know that you guys have a Japanese headquarters as well, specifically in the late '90s. Like a lot of your bikes were headed over that way.
Yeah, we had a good distributor over there that used to buy probably, I don't know, at least 100 frames a year. And but as the market changes over there, you can see that, the sales change and stuff. They went from mountain biking to road bikes and all that kind of stuff. So it just depends. I mean, the market in Japan seems really small right now.
Hmm.
But we do, still have, some followers over there and what have you. But, the industry changes, from year to year, and people, want something a little different next time or whatever. So, I know there are still people over there like collecting this stuff, and always, we get phone calls every now and then looking for bits and pieces to try to restore something. But no, I know there's still a following over there and what have you, but the mountain biking sales is not quite there like it used to be.
Mm. Yeah, definitely from a collector. Oh, go ahead,
Sorry,
Jim.
Steve. I was going to say we were discussing the other day, Brent. Back, I think 2010, we had a concept, the Foes AMX. Do you remember that one that we had at Sea Otter?
Oh yeah.
And I've still got the bike complete as it was in my collection now. But obviously a number of those made their way over to Japan following on from that. And there it is there. Remember that one?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we had a couple of those at Sea Otter in 2010. And yeah, it's amazing there's little markets that pop up for frames like that. But it's interesting because every now and again they pop up for sale, but you never find them anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not too sure how many of those we made. I've done stuff with like DVO with Bryson, and we did a batch of like 50 hardtails that we sort of a DVO Foes combination type thing that we sent over to Japan and stuff like that. But there's not a lot of them out there. Hardtails are, I think they're harder to make than they are suspension bikes. And they take up more room, and the profit margin isn't quite there, just like BMX or whatever.
I have to agree with you on that, definitely. But looking at some of the hardtails that you have made, they are definitely some of the most unique and beautiful looking frames that I've ever personally seen. I'm thinking back to like the late '90s, and obviously Jamie, like the prototype or first generation Zigzag was really something. And I know that you actually made another the LTS2, I think, was also based on that same frame design.
Yeah,
that must have been very low production.
yeah. Some of them were pretty low productions. I don't like making major changes every year on the bikes and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I sort of look at, when a customer buys something, he doesn't want to, have something the following year that's, obsolete and made a lot of major changes. So we tried to make little improvements over the years and stuff like that. But like I said, you get into making hardtails or whatever, it just, they're so labor intensive, and you just can't really make a whole lot of money on them.
Mm.
And we've made, quite a few different versions of them and stuff like that. But it gets to the point where, it was fun making them, but fun doesn't pay the bills. So
Absolutely understand that.
It's one of those things, but yeah, there's a couple different variations out there and stuff. And when I build a bike, I build it just the way I think it looks good to myself, because otherwise I just can't make anything if I'm not happy with it.
Brent, I have a leading question, and I'll lead up to it with a statement, then a question, and then ask my intended question. So you make suspension bikes that just simply work. A lot of your suspension bikes have really good, what they call kinematics. Bikes like my DHS Mono 2-to-1 has very little pedal feedback, has a boatload of travel, has a really good rising rate, so it ramps up, doesn't bottom out. right? So you've got some ability there to do really good suspension designs on a single pivot platform. Do you consider yourself a hardcore mountain biker?
Not really. I mean, I consider myself as a designer fabricator. I mean, that's all I've done all my life.
Yeah.
And I have a tendency to sort of look at something or have something in my mind, and I don't vary from that too much. You know, I might have a couple of different concepts or something, but I've had pretty good luck with putting something together and having it work right away.
How do you arrive at that? Your designs are conceptually simple. You know, I don't know of any foes that isn't a single pivot with possibly a linkage driving the shock, and maybe I'll ask that question in a minute here. So how do you arrive at these designs and put together a bike that works at a very refined level? You know, when I use the word kinematics, I mean that whole suspension platform, its pedaling dynamics, everything seems to work very, very well. How do you arrive at that, especially if you don't consider yourself a hardcore mountain biker?
Well, I mean, you sort of have to get an idea, you know, you're pedaling a bicycle, so you have to get an idea of really what's going on when you're pedaling it and stuff like that, and the chain torque going to the rear wheel, because that has a lot to do with how the suspension's affected. You know, when we got into building our own shocks, the Cornette shocks, that even added more to the pedaling platform of a bicycle, because the way the internals worked in the shock, it worked really well with that, you know, with that type of design. And I wasn't really one to throw a lot of monkey motion into a bike just to make it look unique and you know, try to sell something to somebody that doesn't really know what's going on, or try to, you know, fool the public or something like that. So I try to keep my bikes pretty simple, basically to work on, you know, low maintenance, not a lot of moving parts. So we've always stuck with a single pivot design. And through the years, we've just manipulated the shock with the linkage and stuff. So I've always liked basically the suppleness at the beginning, and then the slow rising rate towards the end, because, you know, on your average, you're working with about 6 inches of travel. So, you know, you don't want the thing to bottom out too soon, but you also want it to pedal well. And so, you know, it's just, you know, keeping things simple, and, you know, I never really get too complicated on the stuff, because I don't think it needs to be.
I think one of the interesting things about your suspension and obviously your involvement with Charlie Kerner as well is obviously a lot of the early development was done between yourself and Charlie, especially in the bike world, on that platform valving. But what most people don't realize is just how much that platform valving was influenced by and used and patented by many other brands throughout the years as well, far bigger brands than most people would realize.
Well, yeah. You know, Charlie, I worked with Charlie Jr. Charlie Sr. was the creator of that system and stuff, which came out of the off-road cars and motorcycles and stuff. And so Charlie Jr. ran this system that we were running on our bicycles, on little Pee-wee motorcycles for the kids that were racing. And the concept is pretty simple. You know, as the shock compresses, there's more pressure applied to the cavity, which we call the cavity, that would push down on the main piston and start slowing the oil down, so it would start stiffening up the shock. And so when I got a hold of Charlie, basically I was looking for a shock to put on my bike, because there was nothing out there that I really was comfortable with, and I wanted to try to outperform the other stuff out there. So when I got a hold of Charlie, you know, he designed a couple shocks that we put on the bikes and tested them, and they evolved over the years. And we probably ran them on our race bikes for 4 or 5 years before we actually started licensing that design to a company called Fifth Element, and then they licensed it to Fox. And so it got out there with all the big brands and stuff like that. And yeah, I've had riders ride the bikes, and they just said, you know, I just can't believe how well this thing works. It just feels like it's bottomless travel. And but we don't do that anymore, just because the shocks have progressed quite a bit, and all of my machine time was being taken up making shock parts and stuff, and I really didn't want to get into the shock business. That's why we didn't sell them to anybody else. They were just for our own bikes. And but I really wanted to concentrate on developing the bikes a little bit more than really getting into the suspension department, because then you got service and warranty and all that stuff. But we ended up building suspension forks. I just built all that stuff as a necessity to work with my frames.
I have to say, this DHS mono I have here behind me, that's the best suspension bike I've ever ridden. The suspension on that thing is so plush, so dialed. I hear it's Troy D'Italia's old race bike. I'm not sure, but that bike feels amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we went through a couple variations of our front forks. They got a little bit bigger and stuff like that. But I just, I used to race motocross for 10 years and stuff. So I took some of that knowledge and put it in the bicycles and what have you. But and I got good feedback from the guys who were racing for me and what have you. But I've been fortunate to, hit that stuff pretty much spot on right from the beginning, without a lot of major changes to get the bikes to work.
So you still riding motorbikes, Brent, or are you still driving the trophy trucks, or?
All I do is work now. I try to get to some of the races and stuff like that. But I've, during my whole bicycle career, I started a couple other businesses, and which keep me occupied too. So it's, I'm always like to create things and do stuff, and my bicycle, building the bicycle is my biggest passion. But, when someone comes to me with an idea about something, I go, well, that looks interesting or whatever, it's hard to say, not to say, I can't do it. I said, I'll give it a shot. So it's keeps me working all the time.
Yeah, so you're still busy developing new products and new ranges. And is there anything for next year that you can tell us about that's coming out soon, or?
Well, we've been busy working on just keeping our production stuff going right now. And I have 2 new e-bikes that we're coming out with. I've been playing around with the e-bikes for probably 7 years now. Built a couple different configurations and stuff. And we do that because we get a lot of people asking about it, and it's a big market. So, in order to stay in business, you sort of got to follow what people want and what have you. Last couple of years, we were selling our e-bikes with the Shimano motors. This next year, we're going to launch our 2 new bikes with the Bosch stuff, just because it's a little easier to get a hold of the stuff and what have you. But, we have a fat tire e-bike and a regular mixed wheel e-bike that we'll be showing, probably around January, I think.
Brent, you seem to have a passion for keeping your products made in America. And I think in a couple cases, that might have been a benefit because it provided you some nimbleness. Your mixer, the whole mullet. I don't know if you call your mixer a mullet. The whole trend, the fat bike trend, it seemed like you were able to pivot and jump on that trend and turn around a product quicker than companies that were building their products in Asia. But can you talk a little bit about your apparent passion for making stuff in America, and what are the pros and cons, the challenges of doing that, because you're one of the last holdouts?
Well, yeah, we take pride in that because, if I was forced to have stuff made overseas, I just, since I like making stuff and like welding and stuff like that, I had no desire to do that. And I've been asked quite a few times, when are you going to have carbon frames made, or when are you going to do this? And if it's involved in having something made overseas, I'm not interested at all. That's why we have all of our own equipment here to make everything. Plus, we could build 10 frames and go, oh, we want to make something different, and switch over and have something done in a month. Where if you went overseas, you're going to spend a lot of money in tooling, and it could take 6 or 8 months. And then by the time you get them, you could have a container full of stuff that isn't what you wanted. So I'm a real firm believer of American made products. And And I think it's coming around to us because it just seems like having stuff made in China and stuff like that is almost, sort of a bad word, But no, as long as I'm building bikes, they'll be made here. And that's just convenient for us because, we can make changes. That's why I have all the equipment to do that. And, it's just something that, we take pride in. And we get a lot of people appreciating that too, So it's just one of those things that, we're not going to change and we just, keep moving forward, making them here.
I think that's one of the great things with Foes is, when other brands, Santa Cruz and Intense, they have gone and followed the carbon route and followed the Far East route. You guys have stuck fast and continued with that made in America thing. And as with most trends, it's coming back around again now. People want aluminium or aluminum, and handmade in America. It's a great accolade and great selling point for the brand.
Yeah, I think so too. I've been doing it long enough to where I can see things go through cycles and what have you. And I constantly see people, asking other brands to, when are you going to come out with an aluminum frame, make it here and that type of stuff. And, when other companies come out with just like a raw aluminum frame, even if it's made overseas, they seem to sell them all. But no, I think you're going to see a trend. It's just, it comes down to cost and everything. If they can companies can still make the stuff overseas and still make a better profit, they're going to continue to do that. We don't look at it that way. We just, sure, I could have my stuff sent over there and made and probably make more money and what have you, but that's not my biggest concern. Everything that I make here, I make it like if it was my own personal bike before it goes out the door. And, we take pride in that as opposed to trying to make a couple extra bucks.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things as well for you guys is obviously other brands have, used other people's frames in the past. In the late 90s, early 2000s, you had various brands using the M1 as a platform, but you've been used as a manufacturer for other bikes like the HB1 for, was it Miata, I think, when Greg was racing for them, or Toby Henderson, THS1.
Yeah.
And that's kind of cool because I guess you make your own stuff, but you're being sought out to make other people's products as well, which is pretty fun.
Yeah, we get contacted all the time. People want us to build, BMX frames. They want, part of our frame, or can you make this or that? And it's, I like to help people out, and give them some ideas and stuff like that. But as far as like getting into production for other companies, it's not something that we really have time to do anymore. Because, I got so many other things going on that, I just, just try to concentrate on our own stuff right now.
Brent, that's a good thing though. You're busy.
Yeah. Like I said, I've started a couple other companies, so that fills in all the other stuff, that keeps us, working 6 days a week. At least I'm here 6 days a week. Try not to do 7, but there's always something that I'm creating and trying to get into production and keeping on top of inventory and what have you.
Brent, you've worked with a lot of big name racers over the years: Toby Henderson, Missy Giove, John Kirkcaldy, probably a bunch I don't even remember. Who's your favorite racer to work with?
Well, they all have their own personalities. And they all worked out really nice and stuff like that. They've done, they were good for the brand and they won races and stuff like that. Guys like one of my first guys that raced for me was Ty Davis. That's known for racing motorcycles and stuff. And we'd go up to Big Bear and he'd race intermediate. And we got a lot of slack for that because they said he was a pro desert racer or motocrosser and he shouldn't be racing intermediate. But he gave me a lot of insight on how the bike's working and what have you. Darren Stockton is another guy that was a good rider and knowledgeable about fitness and stuff, which he helped the teams and stuff like that. Todd LeDuc was another guy that was just, he would just let it all hang out and let it go. And
Still does.
yeah, and Missy Giove, she was a character in her own, but she was a good ambassador and really draw a lot of attention to us and what have you, and really liked the bikes. I mean, even when she started riding for Global, one of her things was she says she still has to ride a Foes bike as opposed to an Orange. So, yeah, there's quite a few different riders that rode for me and they all had their own unique style and what have you. And we learned a lot.
So touching on the racing history, obviously we have the DHS 2-1 behind Chuck there. I had the Hydro after that. I know that I had seen some videos of a prototype negative travel bike as well. And I don't think that made it to production, but is there any plans to bring like a downhill racing sled back into production?
Yeah, there is. I've got some prototype stuff bits and pieces that I'm working on right now. For me to, it's been a while since we've had a new downhill bike come out, but there's some ideas that I want to play around with that we've sort of tested before. And it's a little unique. But it's, we're still fairly small here and I do that stuff in my spare time because I got to keep, production going and what have you. And then I don't want to really rush it, but I'm hoping pretty soon here that we'll have something. I can get some riders testing it for me and stuff like that. Cause that's basically where we started. I mean, it was sort of by accident, coming out with a 6-inch travel bike. First thing we did was, racing downhill at Big Bear, and we were sort of classified as a downhill manufacturer of mountain bikes. And since then we've branched off to a bunch of other stuff that meets more of the public and what have you. Because the downhill is sort of more of a smaller market. But I think now I can probably come out with some unique designs that people will be, could understand as opposed to some of the stuff I came out with, 20 years ago. Some of the stuff that we came out, I didn't never put it in production just because I don't think people really quite understand suspension like they do now.
Yeah, we probably look forward to that though, because there's a lot of brands that would happy coming out today with the Foes DHS mono that you came out with 15 or 20 years ago, and they'd be more than happy with that as a modern day frame because of how
well
interesting to see what you've got.
Yeah, I get a lot of people saying, when are you going to come back out with, with that particular brand, with maybe more modern geometry and stuff like that. But, we've already done that with that bike. So I have some other ideas that I want to play around with. And it's all about just, keeping the bike under control and just keeping traction and all that type of stuff. So there's things that I've been playing around with, but I just, I'm hoping that, maybe in the next, say mid next year, I'll have something that we can maybe start showing people.
Brent, you mentioned, your history in motocross. A lot of people know you have a history in building off-road race trucks. I think you've raced off-road race trucks. I think I've heard you use the term droop travel, especially with regard to this 10-inch travel beast behind me and that prototype that you showed at Sea Otter, I think in 2015, that had that negative travel shock. Droop travel is a term that you don't hear other suspension manufacturers talk about. Does that come from your racing truck background? Where did you come up with that?
Yeah, I mean, from the off-road cars, I mean, our very first cars, that we built, some of the cars, only had 6 inches of travel. So you had to really spring them stiff. So you had travel, so it wouldn't quite bottom out too soon. But as the years went on, you'd end up creating more travel, more travel. Now the trucks nowadays are like 60-40. They got 60% up travel and 40% down travel. And the whole object about that is when the bike starts, or the car, or whatever, starts lifting off the ground, at some point the wheel will lift off the ground, and you're no longer have contact. And once you no longer have contact, you're basically sort of out of control. So on these big trucks that have 30 some inches of travel, as you're going through the hoops and stuff like that, the tire's just following the ground. So you're constantly, when you're on the gas, you're constantly being pushed forward. So can you imagine if you didn't have that kind of travel, then every time the wheel would come off the ground and you're not moving forward. So anyway, I'm a sort of a firm believer in, we've been playing around with a little bit of negative travel, which means, you could have a 10 or 11 inch travel bicycle shock, but there's negative travel in that. So it's not like you're raising the bike up, that high for that travel. It's when you sit on the bike, it settles into the travel. So you're trying to, what I'm trying to do is keep the wheel on the ground. So when you're hitting braking bumps and stuff like that, the more you can keep the wheel on the ground, the better control you have under braking and stuff. So it's either you put the negative travel, build it up in the shock itself, or you do it another way.
Does that concept of negative travel, Brent, work better now with obviously the concept of e-bikes and having that constant power and pedal versus a complete pedal powered bike?
Well, the e-bike, it's a little different because you ride an e-bike a little differently than you do a normal mountain bike, because you're always sitting on it and stuff like that. I don't think it's as critical as a regular mountain bike. But we built up that one bike that you were talking about, I think 2015, that we had a little negative suspension in it. And we did some testing up in Big Bear, and we had people that rode it and they increased their time by quite a bit, just because the wheel just felt like it was always on the ground. And when you're hitting braking bumps or going in corners or whatever, you just felt like you're under control a lot more. But yeah, those are things that if I were to build a shock, I would probably build it into the shock itself. But those are things that is still on the chopping board right now, and that we're probably going to play around with.
Is there a reason why that bike didn't go into production?
I'm not really sure why it didn't go into production. I think we did some testing on it, and it worked really well. It's just, it probably got in the way of our production stuff and what have you, and just didn't have the time to keep testing it right now. But the technology has gotten a lot better as far as making parts and what have you. So it's not out of the question that bike can probably still see the dirt again in a different form.
Well, I'm looking
watch this space.
Looking forward to whatever you come up with next. Hey, and I'm just up here in San Francisco if you ever need a test.
Okay. All right.
Hey, Brent, did you every Foes I know of was a single pivot? Some of them had linkages driving the shocks. Did you ever dabble or test out any multi-pivot bikes?
Never. No, everything we've built has always been a single pivot design. Yeah. And like I said, I'm sort of I like making things a little simple, because I'm a firm believer in making a nice solid swing arm, all triangulated and no moving parts on there, and then going from there. But I'm not saying the other systems don't work and what have you, but I just sort of like the single pivot design. And I think you can get those to work just as well by using linkages for the shock itself.
And you mentioned that you had tried forming some titanium. Have there been any bikes that you've created that have not been aluminum?
No, everything we've made has been all aluminum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we played around with some titanium stuff, but it was a whole nother atmosphere. I mean, the welding process was different than doing aluminum and what have you. So it was just one of those things that it was going to take up too much time in the development part. So we just stuck with the aluminum. It's easy to get, it's easy to work with, and we went through the whole learning curve of heat treating and all that type of stuff. I remember one time when one of my very first frames, we welded up. I took it to the heat treaters, and he said, "Do you want to go just straight heat treat, or do you want anneal it and so you can straighten it, or do you want to?" These are other terms, spray quench it or whatever. And I said, I just need it back to T6. So they heated it up and they stuck it in the water, and it just shriveled up like you step on a beer can. And I go, well, I guess that's not going to work. So we had to go through different processes on how to actually heat treat a monocoque frame without it distorting. And so that was a learning curve just in itself.
Is that different? Is that different than if it were a tubular frame? Heat treating and lining a monocoque?
Well, yeah, I mean, where we go, all the stuff that they do, I'm not really sure on the tubular frames that we've made too, and our monocoque frames, there is a sequence that they go through. So they do what they do is spray quench, as far as they'll put it in the tank and they'll spray water on it, as opposed to just dipping it into water. And that way it doesn't see a sudden shock of temperature change and stuff like that. And so it holds its shape, which allows us that normalizes it and allows us to we actually go to the facility and straighten them all ourselves. And then they age them to a T6.
And one of the things that always surprised me with the frames is just how much tension and stress is contained within them. And I remember when I was over at the factory once, and Chris was testing a DHS bottom bracket for stiffness and see how stiff it was. And when it finally let go, that bottom bracket area went with a huge bang, just because it's so stiff in its construction. When it finally lets go, it
lost Jamie.
Yeah,
I'm back.
Yeah, that's why we straighten everything when it's in a soft condition. But once they've been aged to T6, we can do a little moving around and stuff like that. But you go too far, it'll just pop. It'll crack the weld or crack the aluminum or whatever. But yeah, they definitely have a pretty good memory. And one thing nice about, I've always, people talk about is one thing nice about the aluminum over the carbon is you can lay the bike down on a rock and put a dent in it and still ride the thing, not worry about it, exploding on you or something like that. So, and, over the years, it seems like, when carbon came out, everybody's bragging about how light they are and stuff like that. But they found out over the years that they've had to add material just to make them stronger in certain areas. And our frames haven't really gotten any heavier. So I would say our aluminum frames are real close to the carbon frames, if not lighter, just for that reason.
I don't know that people are really stressing over the weight nearly as much anymore anyway. I mean, the difference between a 31-pound bike and a 32-pound bike just doesn't matter. And then you get into bikes, and the difference between a 55-pound e-bike and a 57-pound e-bike just doesn't matter. And you don't have to wrap an aluminum frame and rubber tape to keep it from, getting stress cracks.
Yeah, the whole industry, they go through stages and stuff like that. when the manufacturers start, then when they don't start talking about weight and stuff like that, then people don't seem to be too concerned about it because, it is what it is, and they don't want all these warranties coming back and stuff. So, but yeah, it's, I don't think it's that big a concern as much as the way they handle and work.
Hey, I know we're getting close on time and we're all busy, but I wanted to go back to the very early days. What was the thought process behind the Leaf Spring bike, and did it really use a Volkswagen Bug spring?
Yeah, I mean, that bike was designed with a leaf spring in mind. And that was, coming back from my off-road days where, we ran leaf springs on our race cars and stuff like that. And we also ran what they call a quarter elliptic spring, which was, it pivoted at one end, and whatever you're pushing, it was pushing on the other end of the spring. So this bike was actually designed for a carbon leaf. And the whole concept behind it was you have a single pivot design, you have a swing arm with a roller at the top, and it would push on the spring. And as it goes through the travel, it would ride down the spring. So the rate would change. And at that time, that bike was designed with I had another company in the off-road industry come up with a shock, and it was made by a company called Sway Away. And the shock was basically what they call a pin shock, which has a tapered pin inside the shock, and it goes through a piston. So as it traveled through the suspension travel, that pin was tapered, and it would start slowing the oil off. So that gave you some rising rate also. But back then, I had a guy make me a carbon leaf, but carbon fiber just wasn't too many people playing around with it in that type of application. And I got to the point where we were going to one of the races and what have you, and I had to get this thing built. So I had, I'm thinking, what can I use to put in there that would fit in that shape and everything? And I'm just thinking, I've been playing around with buggies and stuff all the time, and I had these torsion bar leaves for the front of a Volkswagen Bug. And so I started cutting those up, and I started layering them until I got what I needed. And that's what I worked with. And I mean, it worked fine. It was, heavier than a carbon leaf, but, it was spring steel. I wasn't worried about them breaking, and, it worked out really well. I mean, today, if I were to take that bike and maybe change the angles on the head tube and the seat tube and stuff like that, I think it would be pretty competitive.
So it really used a Volkswagen Bug leaf spring.
Yeah, yeah.
That's so rad.
Yeah, I cut them up into layers, and then I had an aluminum block that they all fit into, and that was on a pivot, so I can actually preload the tension on that too. And as the swing arm rolled forward, it was on a roller, and it would just push on the leaf and slowly get stiffer and stiffer.
So refining the number of leaves and the placement of the leaves, you could fine tune your shock rate and create progressive spring.
It was, you had quite a few different adjustments, like you don't really with a coil spring, other than the tension on the spring itself.
It's a cool concept, actually.
Yeah, no, it's it's something that actually worked out pretty well, in a pinch, and it gave me a lot more tunability and stuff. I think we raced it for a year and a half. I built a couple of them. I think I still have them here. But it was, I was pretty happy with it, for coming up with something in the last minute.
Oh, cool. Hey, what was the relationship with Yokohama? I seem to remember Yokohama was on a lot of the bikes and the racers and the jerseys.
Yeah, they're good friends of ours. We were sponsored by Yokohama when we were running the off-road cars. So a good friend of mine who ran the promotions department for Yokohama, his name's Vic Curl. When I got into the bicycle industry after I got out of the off-road stuff, I noticed there was a lot of mini trucks and trucks coming to the races and what have you. So I called Yokohama and said, hey, what we need to do is get some of your, car tires, your truck tires up at the races, and and start promoting your tires. And so they ended up sponsoring our team. And I think one year we went up to Mammoth with a full blown semi, with tires on display and what have you. And it gave me a place to work out of for the bikes. And it also had a theater inside where you can go in there and actually, see truck tires being built and what have you. So yeah, they were good partners with us in the off-road stuff, and got them interested in the car stuff, or the bicycle stuff. And we would go to like one of the IndyCar races at Long Beach, and we'd take our bikes down, the race bikes down there on display. And I noticed one year there's a whole crowd of people underneath the tent. And I was standing next to one of the vice presidents of Yokohama, and he's going, "Why are there so many people underneath our tent?" Because normally, people aren't really that interested in tires. And he went over there, and they're all looking at the bikes. So it just drew some attention to their product, which sort of worked both ways.
That's amazing. You've got some really great bikes. Obviously, you've worked with some big name racers. What are some other big names that ride Foes? For example, I've seen a picture of Simon LeBon from Duran Duran with a Foes LTS. And I think you hand delivered that bike, right?
Well, he actually came over to my house.
Okay.
When I was building bikes out of my garage, he called up, or somebody called up, and he wanted one of our bikes. And so he came by the house, and we built him an LTS 18, all polished and everything. And so I didn't really know Duran Duran at the time that much, but no, he was one of the guys that came by and picked it up, and really enjoyed it. And he told me some stories and stuff like that. And we also sold a bike to Robin Williams, the comedian.
He's a big bike guy, yeah.
Yeah, he was a big bike collector and stuff like that. And there's been some other.
I remember when we were at the factory one time, and was it Robbie Gordon came by with his massive semi with his Foes bikes in the back.
Yeah, we built some up for him when he was racing Indy cars, and said Babbling on the side. So I sort of brought some of that stuff back to the guys that I knew in the off-road stuff, just for a marketing tool and what have you. And other brands, other companies that I can't think of right now. But yeah, it was just sort of a crossover and stuff. I've worked with guys like Walker Evans and Roger Mears and those guys that well known in the off-road industry. Yeah, so it's pretty good. It's and now I've started another company called Transit Off-Road, which we make accessories for the Ford Transit vans under just a necessity for our own van, and got into making parts for them. And I've realized that all these van people all are into mountain biking. And so we're offering, bikes to these companies and stuff that might be interested in selling them with their vans that they're building up for customers and stuff. So
yeah, do you want to talk about, what you're building today, what you're excited about today, and what you see happening with Foes in the future?
Well, nothing's changed a whole lot other than just, moving along with the times and stuff like that. I'm excited to get our new e-bikes up and going and in production. And then that gives me time to get back on some of the other prototype stuff that I want to finish. But, I started a company with a friend of mine 10 years ago, and we build equipment carts for the film industry. And we have distributors all over the world selling that stuff. And we have patents on different designs and what have you. So, and it all pertains to a guy coming up to me and saying, "Hey, can you make this for me?" And I have some ideas, and I throw my ideas into it. And so we create a product, and then it just grows from there. And then like I said, the van stuff, we make stuff for the Ford Transit vans. Because when I went to Interbike one year, I was looking for a van so we can promote our product and stuff. And Ford had their new van that came out in 2015. So we ended up purchasing one of those. And I want to put bigger tires on it and everything. And there wasn't anything available to actually lift the suspension up. So I had to just create all my own stuff. And then it just, people saw it and they go, where do you get this or where do you get that? And so we're just slowly, we have, a product line now that we offer for the vans. And now I'm actually, I think this week, the van is down at a company called King Shocks. And they were actually, there's a lot of stories, but they used to make custard shocks for my bicycles back when. And now it's called King Shocks. And now I've got them actually building custom shocks for our van, which I'm hoping will go into production pretty soon.
Are you still
that's interesting because it's
What's that?
Chuck.
Are you still making pit bike parts?
We dabbled with that again, and then the market slowed down again. So I vowed not to get back into that anymore.
Okay.
It's fun, but then it just takes up machine time and what have you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jimmy.
I didn't know the tie-in between Custer and King Shocks actually, Brent. So that's quite interesting because there's a few topics around on how to rebuild them, and nobody really knows. And is there anyone there that we could reach out to that may be able to give us some help with those?
Yeah, well, back when I was looking for a shock manufacturer, because I first started out with Nolene, and I had a hard time getting shocks out of them. So I ended up talking to a company called Custer, which was making off-road shocks, and that's who I knew from the off-road industry. And Lance King, who worked for Custer, they're basically a company that made measuring devices for oil wells and stuff, but they were making off-road shocks on the side. And then Lance King, I met with him and we sat down and he designed a bicycle shock for us. And he actually, produced them, a small number of them for some other bike brands also. But it got to the point where, those things, they were trying to make all these cool parts to fit into a little shock. And then at the time, trying to sell it for $150 or $200. It just wasn't profitable. So they had to stop making them. But there are some out there. I'm not sure how many, but they were a unique shock that had some neat features to it. And but yeah, there's his son, Brent King, is now in charge of all the off-road stuff, and they got a huge factory making shocks, and they're one of the well-known off-road shock manufacturers for trophy trucks and street cars or whatever. So it seems like it's gone full circle. I'm working with him again for building these big shocks for the vans and stuff.
Brent, I've got one last question for you. Obviously, you've been doing this for quite some time, and you were one of the pioneers in this, and you've seen many changes across your history in the mountain bike world. Is there any particular project or product that you produce that you would say is your favorite or the most fun that you've done? I know with the monocoque frame design has given you an opportunity to really put your flair on a lot of things. Like I'm thinking about the Foes Inferno, for instance. What would you say is your favorite bike that you've ever made?
I would say probably the 2-to-1 mono, the one with the big shock that we made. Mm-hmm. Just because it gave me a chance to play around with it and stuff like that, because it had a frame, still single pivot, but it had linkage working the shock. We had a big shock on it with a dual rate spring. Mm-hmm. We made our own fork for it. So basically that bike, we were making everything for it. I mean, we weren't using any other outside manufacturers. I mean,
all proprietary.
I don't know of too many other companies that would even do that or even did that,
Right down to the front and rear hubs too, and the discs, rotors, and everything. Yeah.
We just made everything. And it was fun. I mean, learning how to make all that stuff and what have you, but it's when you get into making forks and shocks, that's a little different than just making a frame and what have you, because the tolerance is a lot closer and what have you. But it was something that I could look at and say, you know, I made everything on there other than the drivetrain.
I have to agree with you on that. I think that is one of the most amazing, full, complete systems of a bike that I've ever seen from any manufacturer, and the level of completeness is impeccable.
Yeah, you know, we took a lot of pride in that, and you know, it's just nice to see something that somebody could ride that you can say, you know, I made everything on there, and get some good, you know, feedback and thumbs up on it, you know.
Yeah, that's the
Absolutely.
only bike I think that was ever shown on the History Channel, and it was like World's Strongest Machines, and it was a Foes mono DHS 2-to-1.
Yeah, I remember that
Yep.
History Channel. It was the world's strongest bike or something like that. I'm not really sure, but
I think we've all got a DHS with XTD forks on it, right, guys?
Do we all have one?
Yep.
Everyone's got one in the collection.
yeah, the very first forks, inverted forks that we made, I actually had a company make them for me, did all the machine work for me, and we did I think we made about 2,000 of them.
And they were pretty lightweight, weren't they? Weren't they like
Yeah,
100 pounds?
yeah, they were fairly light, and they came with. I had to supply them with. I supplied them with formula brakes, and
Because they were a right side brake, I think. The drive
yeah,
side. Yeah.
yeah, and
Was that LA Gauge Company?
yeah, yeah, they were a machine shop in Burbank,
Mhm.
and I gave them all my drawings and stuff like that, and we worked out a deal where they would, you know, they would build them, assemble them, put them in a box, and I just got a box from them. And then they sort of evolved over the years. I've changed them a little bit, and then we went to the newer fork, which we made everything in house and stuff like that. So, but yeah, it was just something to work with the rear suspension because, you know, of the travel and stuff.
Well, yeah, 1993. Maybe you didn't intend on becoming a downhill bike company, but who was making bikes and travel bikes in 1993 other than you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of people thought it was unnecessary. You didn't need that kind of travel and what have you. But, you know, like I said, I've always said that, you know, if it's there, you know, and you needed it, it's, you know, it works. But yeah, I remember, you know, the very first one I built, I took it up into the mountains and rode it. And we had the old Marzocchi forks on the front that I got from Bryson. And I was up there riding it, and John Carr, who's a photographer for Mountain Bike Action, he asked if he could take some pictures of it. And I said, sure, no problem. And this is basically how I got started in the business. And a couple months later, the photograph showed up in the Mountain Bike Action buyer's guide. And I had people calling me wanting to know when the bike's available. And I go, well, what are you talking about? You know, and he said, well, I saw it in the buyer's guide. And that's when I found out that he posted that. And now I said, oh no, what am I going to do? You know, so I either have to say, you know, I'm going to make them or I'm not. So a good friend of mine that just graduated from USC business class, he says, well, if you're going to build bikes or anything, you need to come up with a business plan. So we scheduled an appointment to go to the college, and I presented this bike to about 40 students to get a business plan written up, you know, because they were going to do it for free. And then it just sort of took off from there. And I figured I think our first 50 or 60 bikes we had welded up by Control Tech up in Portland before we started doing them ourselves. And I figured, God, we're going to sell 50 or 60 bikes and become rich. And that never happened, but that was sort of the start of the whole thing. And it just, you know, just sort of snowballed from there. And it's mostly the passion that keeps me going, that I like creating stuff. It's not the money. It's just the passion and stuff that I like creating stuff. And somebody go out and ride the bike and come back and say, hey, I really enjoyed it and stuff. So that makes it worth it to me.
Your passion combined with your mechanical know-how and your history with motocross, off-road race trucks. You talk about your design process, where you're able to put together these bikes that just work in my view perfectly, but you do it without the aid of kinematics design engineers, things like this. You've got a real innate mechanical know-how combined with that passion that it just speaks volumes. Every one of your bikes just shows.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with engineers and stuff like that, and that's, back in the day when we were making cars and stuff like that, I mean, you made things out of, cardboard templates and, life-size moving parts and stuff like that. And you didn't have the access that you do now to speed things up and what have you, and all the rapid prototyping stuff and all that other stuff and we do that now to help things out. But back then there was nothing like that. So you just sort of had to create something, go test it, and if it didn't work, go back and change it and what have you. But I've learned a lot with some structural engineers and working with them. But I think a lot of it just has to be, you got to have a common sense on how things, the punishment they go through and what you're trying to achieve and how things work and what have you. So I've had some pretty good luck with that, just, coming up with ideas and not have to go through tremendous changes to get something that's, works well.
There's something to be said for garage engineering. I was at a Wilderness Trail Bikes for a while, and I don't know if you remember, in the late 90s, Wilderness Trail Bikes was also helping Eric Koski. Koski was making his stems and handlebars and stuff like that, but they were being designed by Eric Koski and Charlie Cunningham and Mark Slade. They would do like finite element analysis on the stems and stuff like that, and kind of look at it and put it aside, and then put the bar on a jig with a big pry bar on it and just see if they could break it. And that's really what it came down to. They didn't trust the computer models. They would just see if they could break the darn thing. And when they could no longer break it, that's when it was good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's something to say about that. I mean, that's what people did before there was all these other computers. And sometimes, you can't really trust that stuff, I mean, you can do all the testing in the world, but once you get it in the consumer's hands, that's a whole nother story. And, it could be totally off.
Yeah. Yep. Brent, this is amazing. You're an amazing guy, and really appreciate what you've done for our sport, dating all the way back to the early 90s to present day. I was talking to Danny prior to this conversation about your upcoming e-ticket 2.0, which I'm really excited about. I understand that you're going to be launching the revised e-ticket with a Bosch drive system.
Yeah. With the Bosch, with a couple different they have two different options on the motors and stuff, and they allow us to run bigger batteries and stuff. So we just finished up a couple of prototypes right now. They've got to go get heat treated so we can put them together and test them. But that's, once I get those things sorted out, then I can start dabbling in some of the other stuff we talked about.
I'm looking forward to the new e-ticket. If people peruse your Instagram, there's a video from your open house yesterday where you can see a little bit of the e-ticket. If people
yeah, those are just the raw aluminum forms that we put together and make sure all the thing fits right and what have you before we go out and heat treat them.
Yep. Anything else coming up in your bicycle lineup?
There's a couple brands. The LTS, we haven't built that in a couple of years, and I've got a new version of that I'm working on. We've just I'm trying to, like I said, we're still fairly small, so there's always something to do. But I'm always thinking, so that's what gets me into trouble.
Well, we love it and we benefit from it.
All right. Well, I don't know how long I'm going to keep doing this, but as long as I enjoy coming to work and still make stuff, I'm going to keep plugging away.
Well, Brent, thank you so much for what you do. And thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us today. We really appreciate it. You have thousands of fans around the world that are probably really going to enjoy listening to this conversation. So really appreciate your taking time to join us today.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. And I'm more than free to let people know what I do, because it's really no secret. I just like building bikes, and I just keep doing it.
Well, we'd love to hear from you again when you got something new coming out. Maybe do a presentation on something.
Sure. All right. Well, I'll keep you guys posted.
Awesome.
Yeah, 100%.
Sounds
All right,
good,
gentlemen.
All right.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Brent, thank you.
Okay, Jamie. See you
Very
later.
nice meeting you, Brent.
All right. Bye.
All right.